For 3.5 years while this conflict has raged, or 3 years while it's raged, no one else has been able to bring something together like what we saw today, because Donald Trump is the only leader in the world that can. So no one is being sidelined here. But President Trump is in a position that he campaigned on to initiate a process that could bring about an end to this conflict.
I was there with Secretary Bessent last week in Kiev. Now we've got Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, in Saudi Arabia. You had Pete Hegseth going over, the Secretary of Defense, to NATO. And this is a totally different America than we had under Joe Biden. And what we're seeing, though, is, of course, the international media isn't telling that story at all. The international media is saying that the Trump administration and what America is doing, it's tearing apart the fabric of our shared consensus and tearing apart the fabric of shared values. And I'm sitting here going, wait a minute, he's talking about a peace deal and ending World War III. There's a huge disconnect.
Well, absolutely. And for more than 4 years, really for 8-9 years, they've been saying you can't talk to Russia. Now there's a war we're trying to stop between Russia and Ukraine, and they're still saying you can't talk to Russia. Anybody who's been as much as a parent knows that when you've got two sides that are fighting and you want to be the peacemaker, you got to talk to both sides. And we've let the media dictate that agenda and that narrative, and we've let that continue on. And any even discussion of bringing Putin and Russia into the talks has, they've tried to turn you into a leper and you're anti-American, when in fact, if you truly are a peacemaker, we've got to sit people down and talk to them. And that's what's happening. I was really impressed with Rubio and Waltz, what they're doing over there, and Witkoff. And their press conference was incredible when they talked about, once we get this war wrapped up and wound down, what the possibilities are. We can start to have, instead of talking about war and how we end the strife, we can start to talk about how can we grow and how can we as Americans now finally prosper. We can have economic deals. We can have growth between the two countries, and we should be looking at that. We want peace worldwide. We want to end wars. And I talk about this when I was on the campaign trail with Mexico, because we talk so much about how we're angry about what's happening on the border. We got to stop what's happening on the border. And eventually we got to work with Mexico to end it and to get their cooperation in it. And then we can turn something that right now, because, I'm just talking about it from Arizona's perspective, the border has been such a negative because we've watched as cartels are controlling it. We have no control. People are pouring in. Drugs are pouring across. Once we get all these serious problems corrected, then we can start looking at our proximity to the border and how we can capitalize on it for both sides. And so, President Trump wants to, I really believe that he wants every American involved in solving our problems, and he wants peace and prosperity for every American. I believe he wants peace and prosperity for every nation. There's roughly 190 different countries out there, Jack, and I've always had a dream that, we have 190 countries with 190 duly elected leaders, 190 unique cultures. That's how we have a peaceful and prosperous world, and that's what I think President Trump is ultimately going for. And we're seeing that start, and he's working fast. I've never seen so much happen in 4 months. I joke every morning is Christmas morning, every night is New Year's Eve with this administration.
Well, I think it's exactly right, Kari. And at the end of the day, the way this story is told, and this is the importance, I think, for the independent media. And I just have to say that, I'm so honored to have been invited to something like this, but it's a responsibility too, because what the White House is doing, it's actually radical transparency, right? There are no closed room meetings and closed doors anymore. They're inviting social media influencers and independent voices to come to the White House or come on some of these trips and delegations to actually be there to put people, the regular person, in the front row seat of what's going on, whether it be Ukraine, whether it be Russia, whether it be, perhaps we'll see very soon here, the border with Mexico. And I know certainly at Real America's Voice, we've been embedding with ICE, the great Ben Bergquam, going down there on multiple raids. We've never seen this from an administration, just take the politics aside for a second, being willing to show that level of transparency. And it's hilarious because the media can't stand that they seem to have lost their special privileges.
Well, they don't want transparency. I love that you called it radical transparency. They don't want transparency because when we start to have transparency, we start to see very blatantly the corruption and fraud at the hands of many people the media has been running cover for. You ask anybody who covered the media, who was in the press pool during the Obama administration, and I don't think any of them got a chance to ask the President Obama a question. He really was not transparent. He was not open to the media. He did very few one-on-one interviews with the press pool. And President Trump is so available to the media. He's made everybody who in his administration available to the media, available to the American public. I agree, and I think you might remember this, and many of your listeners and viewers remember it. Remember in the first Trump administration when they threw out the idea of, hey, let's move the press pool over to the Eisenhower Administrative Building next door because we can do it in a bigger room, and then we don't just have the same 60 or 50 people. We can open it up to 200 people in the press. Remember how the mainstream media had a meltdown over that? Do you remember that?
I remember that very well. And actually, I pointed out at the time that, in fact, that would actually be a reversion to mean because that's the same exact building and I believe the same conference room where JFK would give his press briefings in the great. That's because back then the Brady press room, that small press room where it is now, was actually the swimming pool. But that room in the past was this huge auditorium. And Biden, of course, used it as sort of this fake Oval Office. He may have thought it was the real one. I'm not going to say that he did. But yeah, you're allowing more people in there. Caroline Leavitt's got that fantastic seat that's open for new media. And Kari, just, in the last minute that we have with you, you came in to start your career and at a different time when corporate media had all the power. And now that's completely been turned upside down.
It's been turned upside down on its head. And the reason I think that Caroline Leavitt and the communications team in the Trump administration should take that idea back up again, moving things over, is when you go from 60 journalists to 160, what changes is the narrative because the media balked at that. They didn't want new questions. And so much their narrative is not just the stories they cover, it's the questions they ask. And they were always trying to ask questions that had the Trump team on their heels. We need to change the questions we're asking. We need to stop asking the questions that the mainstream media wants us asking and start asking the questions that the public wants. We want more cases and examples of where our government has been misspending or fraudulently spending our tax dollars. And I think if we open it up to more media and more less mainstream media, more independent media, and maybe even take questions from everyday Americans,